Grace found the envelope in her mail and knew immediately she shouldn't open it. Monaco, April 1978. It had arrived with the morning's correspondence, mixed in among charity requests and official invitations. No return address. Just her name written in handwriting she didn't recognize. The palace secretary had already sorted through everything, removing anything questionable, so whatever this was had passed inspection. But Grace's hands trembled as she held it. She was in her private sitting room, morning coffee going cold on the table beside her. Rainier was already in his office. The children were at school or university. She was alone. She opened the envelope. Inside was a single photograph, black and white, slightly faded. Grace stared at it and felt 27 years collapse into nothing. The photograph showed a young woman on a film set, laughing at something off camera. She wore a simple dress, her hair was loose, and her face was completely unguarded. Grace recognized herself immediately even though she looked like a stranger. This was Grace Kelly at 24, during the filming of Mogambo in 1953. She remembered that day. Remembered Clark Gable making some ridiculous joke. Remembered feeling young and free and certain that her whole life was ahead of her, full of infinite possibility. The woman in this photograph had no idea that in 3 years she'd be Princess Grace of Monaco. No idea she'd give up acting. No idea she'd spend the next quarter century trapped in a role she never auditioned for. She looked so happy, so alive. Grace couldn't remember the last time she'd looked like that. There was a note tucked behind the photograph. Grace pulled it out with shaking fingers. Thought you might want this. Found it in an old studio archive. You were magnificent. Still are, I imagine, though I suppose princesses aren't allowed to be magnificent, just appropriate. With love and old memories, John. John Ford, the director of Mogambo. Grace hadn't thought about him in years. He'd been tough on set, demanding, impossible to please. But he'd also pushed her to be better, to dig deeper, to find the truth in every scene. He'd treated her like a real actress, not just a pretty face. And this photograph, this moment he'd captured or had someone capture, showed exactly that. Grace Kelly the actress. Not the Ice Queen. Not the fairy tale princess. Just a young woman doing work she loved. Grace carried the photograph to the window and held it up to the light. The woman in the frame seemed to glow from within. That's what passion did. That's what purpose did. Grace tried to remember what that felt like, being so absorbed in work that you forgot to perform, forgot to worry about how you looked or what people thought. She couldn't remember. It had been too long. 22 years since she'd acted in a film. 22 years since she'd been allowed to be Grace Kelly instead of Princess Grace. The woman in this photograph was dead. Grace was holding a picture of a ghost. Her own ghost. The person she'd killed to become a princess. She sat down heavily, still clutching the photograph. Why had John sent this now? Was it kindness or cruelty? A reminder of what she'd been or what she'd lost? Maybe both. Maybe he'd heard she was unhappy. Hollywood gossip traveled even to Monaco. Maybe he wanted her to remember that she'd been somebody once. That Grace Kelly had mattered before Princess Grace erased her. Grace traced her finger over the photographed face, that laughing girl who had no idea what was coming. She wanted to reach through time and warn her. Don't do it. Don't marry the prince. Don't give up your career for a crown. Don't trade yourself for a fairy tale that's actually a nightmare. But of course she couldn't. That girl was gone. That moment was gone. All that remained was this photograph and the empty shell of the woman who'd once been her. A knock on the door made Grace jump. She shoved the photograph back in the envelope and tucked it under a cushion. Come in. It was Marie, her secretary, carrying more correspondence. Your Highness, the photographer is here for this afternoon's portrait session. Should I tell him you'll be ready in an hour? Portrait session. Right. Some magazine was doing a feature on Princess Grace at 50. Well, 48 technically, but close enough. They wanted elegant photos of her in the palace, looking serene and regal and perfectly preserved. The irony wasn't lost on Grace. They wanted to photograph the performance. The facade. The lie. Not the woman sitting in this chair holding a picture of who she used to be. Tell him I need 2 hours, Grace said. I'm not feeling well. Marie's face creased with concern. Should I cancel? I can reschedule for next week. Grace almost said yes. Almost used illness as an excuse to avoid one more performance. But what would that accomplish? The photographer would just come back. The magazine would still run their feature. Princess Grace would still have to pose and smile and pretend she was living a fairy tale. No, 2 hours is fine. Just tell him I'll be ready then. Marie nodded and left. Grace pulled the envelope back out and stared at it. 2 hours. She had 2 hours to transform from the woman holding this photograph of her younger self into Princess Grace, perfect and poised and ready to be captured on film once more. Except this time she wouldn't be acting. She'd just be existing. Being decorative. Being what everyone expected. Grace stood and walked to her bedroom. She laid the photograph on her vanity where she could see it while she got ready. That laughing girl could keep her company while she applied the mask. While she became Princess Grace for the 1000th time. The makeup came first. Foundation to even her skin tone, to hide the lines and spots that 48 years of living had earned her. Powder to set it. Blush to give her color since she'd gone pale. Eye makeup carefully applied to make her eyes look wider, younger, more like the girl in the photograph. Lipstick in a neutral shade. Nothing too bold. Princesses didn't wear bold lipstick. Grace worked methodically, watching her face transform from tired middle-aged woman to polished princess. The woman in the mirror looked perfect. Empty. Dead. Next came the hair. Grace's stylist came 3 times a week to maintain the careful blonde that was more expensive and time-consuming with every passing year. Grey kept invading despite their best efforts. Today Grace styled it herself, pinning it into the elegant chignon everyone expected. Princess Grace's signature look. Timeless. Classic. Boring. The girl in the photograph had messy hair, windblown from being on location. She hadn't cared. She'd been too busy being brilliant to worry about whether every strand was in place. Grace looked from the photograph to the mirror and saw the distance between them. 24 years. 2 different people. One alive, one barely surviving. The makeup was armor. The hair was a helmet. Together they created Princess Grace, impenetrable and perfect. The dress came last. Grace chose carefully from her closet. Not too formal but not too casual. Elegant but not ostentatious. The magazine would want her to look appropriately royal without being intimidating. She selected a pale blue dress with a modest neckline and 3/4 sleeves. Safe. Appropriate. The kind of thing Princess Grace always wore. She put it on and examined herself in the full-length mirror. Yes, this was the image they wanted. Timeless elegance. Refined beauty. The fairy tale princess in her palace. Grace wanted to scream. Wanted to rip off the dress and the makeup and the careful hair and show them the real her. The tired, angry, desperate woman who'd been performing for 22 years and couldn't remember how to stop. But of course she didn't. She smoothed the dress, checked her makeup one final time, and picked up the photograph. She couldn't leave it on the vanity. Someone might find it. Might ask questions. Might see the pain in Grace's eyes when she looked at her younger self and realized the fairy tale was a lie. She tucked it back in the envelope and put it in her nightstand drawer, next to the scripts she'd been collecting. Her secret archive of who she'd been. Evidence that Grace Kelly had existed before Princess Grace killed her. Maybe that's all she could do now. Collect evidence. Preserve memories. Prove to herself that she'd been real once, even if no one else remembered. Grace left her bedroom and walked through the palace corridors toward the room that had been set up for the photo shoot. She could hear voices, the photographer and his assistant setting up lights and arranging furniture. They were creating a set. A stage for Princess Grace to perform on. How appropriate. Her whole life was a stage now. Every moment choreographed, every gesture calculated. She paused outside the room and took a breath. Then another. She was about to spend the next 3 hours being photographed, having her image captured and distributed to magazines around the world. Millions of people would see these photos and think they knew her. Would see Princess Grace and believe that's all she was. None of them would ever know about the photograph in her nightstand. About Grace Kelly at 24, laughing on a film set, doing work she loved. That version of her was hidden. Secret. Known only to Grace herself. She pushed open the door and stepped into the room. "Your Highness." The photographer rushed forward, bowing slightly. He was young, eager, clearly excited to be photographing Princess Grace. "Thank you so much for making time for us. This is such an honor." Grace smiled, the practiced smile that showed nothing. "Of course. Where would you like me?" The photographer guided her to a chair positioned near a window. The light was perfect, he explained. Soft and flattering. They'd arranged flowers on a nearby table. Very elegant. Very princess. Grace sat where she was told and folded her hands in her lap. The photographer stepped back, examining her through his camera. "Beautiful. Can you tilt your head slightly?" "Yes, perfect. Now just relax and think pleasant thoughts." Pleasant thoughts. Grace almost laughed. What pleasant thoughts should she think? About her loveless marriage. Her children who barely knew her. The career she'd sacrificed. The life she'd wasted. No. She'd think about the photograph. About that girl on the film set. About the moment before everything went wrong. She'd think about Grace Kelly and try to channel some of that light, that aliveness, into this performance. Even if it was fake. Even if she was just pretending. At least she could give that much. The camera started clicking. Flash after flash. The photographer called out directions and Grace obeyed. "Turn this way. Lift your chin. Soften your expression. Look out the window. Look at the camera. Smile. Don't smile." She was a mannequin. A doll. Princess Grace being moved into position and captured for posterity. "Wonderful," the photographer said between shots. "You're a natural. So elegant. So graceful. You must have been amazing in films." The past tense hit Grace like a slap. Must have been. As if that version of her was so distant, so impossible to imagine, that it might as well have been a different person. Which it was, she supposed. Grace Kelly the actress and Princess Grace of Monaco were two different people. They just happened to share the same body. "I enjoyed it very much," Grace said carefully. "But that was a long time ago." The photographer nodded, already focused on his next shot. A long time ago. A lifetime ago. The girl in the photograph wouldn't recognize the woman in this chair. Wouldn't understand how she got here or why she stayed. The shoot continued. An hour passed. Then two. Grace sat and stood and turned on command. She changed outfits twice, each dress more perfect than the last. She smiled and looked serene and embodied everything Princess Grace was supposed to be. And the whole time, she thought about that photograph in her nightstand. About John Ford sending it after all these years. About what he'd written. "Still magnificent, I imagine, though I suppose princesses aren't allowed to be magnificent, just appropriate." He understood. He'd seen through the facade. He knew she was dying inside this role. And his gift wasn't the photograph itself, but the reminder that she'd been something else once. Someone else. Someone who mattered not because of a title but because of talent and work and passion. Finally, the photographer announced he had everything he needed. Grace stood stiffly, her body aching from holding poses for 3 hours. "Thank you, Your Highness. These are going to be beautiful. You're going to be on the cover for sure." The cover. Her face on newsstands around the world. Princess Grace frozen in time once again. Grace smiled and thanked him and escaped as quickly as dignity allowed. Back to her rooms. Back to the photograph. She pulled it out and looked at it again. That girl. That laughing, vital girl. Where had she gone? When exactly had Grace Kelly died? Was it the moment she said yes to Rainier's proposal? The day of the wedding? The first time she had to cut a ribbon instead of reading a script? Or had it been slower? A gradual erasure over years until one day Grace looked in the mirror and didn't recognize herself anymore. She thought about John Ford's note. With love and old memories. He'd loved her work. Had respected her talent. Had seen her as an actress, not a decoration. When was the last time anyone had loved Grace for what she could do rather than how she looked? When was the last time her work had mattered more than her appearance? She couldn't remember. In Monaco, her only job was to be beautiful and appropriate. To smile and wave and wear expensive dresses. Anyone could do that. There was nothing special about being decorative. But acting, creating characters, finding truth in scripts and bringing it to life. That had been special. That had been hers. And she'd given it up for this. For photo shoots and state dinners and a lifetime of being Princess Grace. Grace put the photograph in a frame she found in a drawer. Then she placed it on her nightstand where she'd see it every morning and every night. Let the staff wonder. Let them ask questions. She didn't care anymore. This photograph was proof that she'd been somebody once. That Grace Kelly had existed and had been magnificent. Not appropriate. Not perfect. Magnificent. She stood looking at it as afternoon light filled her room. Tomorrow there would be another obligation. Another performance. Another day of being Princess Grace. But tonight she had this photograph. This evidence. This ghost of who she'd been. And maybe that would be enough to survive one more day. And then another. And another. Until finally, mercifully, the performance could end. She thought about writing to John. Thanking him for the photograph. Telling him how much it meant. But what would she say? That she was miserable. That she regretted everything. That seeing her younger self had broken something inside her that couldn't be repaired. Grace went to her desk and pulled out a sheet of stationery. She would write to John after all, but carefully. Nothing that could be used against her if the letter were ever intercepted or leaked. She picked up her pen and began to write. Dear John, thank you for the photograph. I had forgotten that moment entirely until I saw it captured so perfectly. You always had an eye for truth, even when your subjects were trying to hide it. That girl on the set of Mogambo thought she had all the time in the world. She believed she could do everything, be everything. She had no idea how quickly time passes, or how final our choices become. Sometimes I wonder what advice I would give her if I could. Would I tell her to hold on tighter to that moment? To never let it go? Or would I tell her that some losses are inevitable, that we all become people we no longer recognize, that the girl in that photograph was always going to disappear eventually? I don't know. But seeing her again, seeing that unguarded joy, reminded me of something I had forgotten. Not how to be happy. I think I lost that long ago. But how to recognize happiness when I see it. And that counts for something. Thank you for reminding me that once I was real. That I mattered for reasons beyond my title, my marriage, or my ability to wear a crown. With gratitude and old affection, Grace. She read the letter again. It said everything, and nothing. John would understand. He had always been able to read between her lines. Grace sealed the envelope and set it aside to mail tomorrow. Then she returned to the photograph resting on her nightstand. The afternoon light was fading now. In a few hours she would have to go downstairs, sit across from Rainier, smile politely, and make small talk about the day's events. But for now, she allowed herself to sit quietly with the image of her younger self. And to grieve. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Princesses didn't fall apart. But quietly, privately, she mourned the death of Grace Kelly. The girl who had been slowly buried over 22 years by the demands of becoming Princess Grace. Grace reached out and touched the frame of the photograph. I'm sorry, she whispered softly to her younger self. I'm so sorry for what I did to you, for what I let them do to you. The girl in the photograph kept laughing. She didn't know what was coming. The prince. The wedding. The cage. She still believed in infinite possibility. Still Grace Kelly. Still alive. Still magnificent. Footsteps sounded in the corridor outside the room. Another reminder that the world was waiting. Grace stood and smoothed her dress, walking to the mirror one last time. Princess Grace looked back at her, perfect and composed. But now Grace could see something else beneath the surface. A ghost. Grace Kelly, trapped somewhere inside Princess Grace, pressing against the glass, trying to get out. The photograph had done that. It had made the invisible visible. Grace knew she could never bring that girl back. But she could preserve the evidence. The photographs. The scripts. The memories. A secret archive of who she had once been. Tomorrow the magazine photographs would be developed and published. Tomorrow Princess Grace would appear on covers around the world, elegant, poised, exactly as people expected. But here, in this quiet room, on this small nightstand, the real Grace would remain. Captured at 24. Forever laughing. Forever magnificent. And maybe, just maybe, remembering that girl would be enough to help Grace survive another day.